you've got this amazingly and precisely considered practice of 3D printed ceramics with really brilliant glaze techniques. So I just wanted to ask you a bit about your technical backgrounds in using this kind of software and how you've come across the shapes and design in your practice.
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be here. I've been working in industry, architecture and structural engineering for a long time, 20 years or whatnot. What always bothered me was how unconnected and fragmented that industry is. So that's how, when I started my research into 3D printing, because I was thinking, well, if you design something on a computer, then if you can build that directly, like it would be a very, streamline of the data processes there. And so that's how I saw the potential in 3D printing. Well, using clay as a medium and creating ceramics, I don't know, I think like clay is a definition of matter, and everything else comes out of clay in a sense. So that's why I really love working with clay and using the material that doesn't have much carbon footprint, and essentially thinking how you can scale this up into the one-to-one scale architecture element that you can build houses with. So just to give a little bit of context, like concrete, for example, is producing about 8% of total carbon emission worldwide, and that's how, I'm thinking to replace it somewhat.
No, and that's fascinating. You've just been at a conference in Singapore, so could you tell a little bit about the paper on this subject, which relates a little bit to this practice as well?
Correct. Like these two objects which are sitting at the front, because the design of the objects were informed by biomimicry principles, like looking at termite nests and how the temperature inside termite nests is always constant because they dig these channels through the nest. I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. Or cactus, for example, that shade, the geometry shade itself, and for them to minimize the water loss. So that was how this shape came about. Like essentially all these channels within this are there for the air to flow through it. So the geometry can essentially cool itself down.
Yeah, and it's allowed you to do a lot more dynamic designs as well. Like usually 3D printed ceramics, it's a very unstable medium because it's soft clay building over itself. So by designing it in such a considered way, you're able to do a lot more dynamic pieces. So what has been some of the shapes that you've been able to achieve with your practice that you think that you probably wouldn't see anywhere else in 3D printed ceramics?
It's very interesting. Like what I found that clay has a life of its own. So it does, as Sarah was talking about, it does what it's want to do. There is a limit to it, and how you can control it or not. Especially when it comes to 3D printing, it's quite a challenge. You gotta reverse every second layer for it to cancel the internal forces or whatnot. But what I found the most fascinating is the very precise material deposition that the techniques gives us, that essentially doing something new with the very old medium that hasn't been, at least in our known history, we don't know if this been the case that anybody would have been able to produce something like that. I mean, and maybe that has been.
It gives them some kind of futuristic or alien type look, but you've got these really profound color choices you've also done in the work. So why are rusted colors something of interest in the way you color the pigment of your pieces?
Well, it's got to do with the geometry. Essentially, I'm trying to emphasize on the specific elements of the design and then bold them out using a different choice of colors. So that's been essentially that. For example, for these objects, there are air channels that goes through it. So so it's essentially a thermos. So I'm trying to emphasize those air channels with the different colors. And So essentially, I suppose the form, type of, and the choice of available glazes as well. So.
Yeah, and it's based on temperature. That's really cool. And just like Sarah's work, your works also have some interesting naming of them. So I believe this work's called Starfish.
This is Jam Jam.
Yeah.
It has some historical reasoning behind the name. So Jam is a very famous metaphorical jam in Iranian culture, or like something that you drink wine out of. So that was the idea. So I wanted to fill this with wine. These two are seashells. So because it has that like look of, I don't know, coral look in a sense to it. And the other one called Fears, which is essentially a translation of the name blue in a sense.
That's cool. And one last question, and that's, I've given you a bit of a challenge. I'm bringing you into a drawing exhibition, but how do you think your work relates to drawing terminology?
Of course. I mean, you got to design something first on the paper and then trying to translate that into the digital workflow. So I always use, like, you know, the proportion of this is like, I don't know, phi and pi and all the mathematics built into it, but you have to draw it first and then try to model it within the computer. So it's always a start with a piece of paper, like to do the drawing. And just one last thing you asked about the conference, it was essentially to bring in these elements into the facade of the building, making cladding for the building using 3D printing.
So these objects were giant. That's going to be really cool. I'd love to see that. Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you.